Merci, Professor Touvier, and also to the College of France for the opportunities to speak here today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity and for the hospitality, especially to talk about food and food systems in a country that is celebrated for its food culture and cuisine. And the food in France is just incredible. So thank you also for some good meals over the last few days. My interest in this topic on this topic in particular began through my travels. And I'm sure, like many of us here today, we have witnessed firsthand the encroachment of ultra-processed foods into many countries. And in my case, into some of the world's remotest locations. I've witnessed Coca-Cola on remote Pacific Islands in Fiji. Once I climbed the highest mountain in Vietnam, and I found there was a man selling Coca-Cola on the top of that mountain. But here you can see a picture from a community store in the jungle of North Sumatra in Indonesia, which demonstrates the encroachment of ultra-processed foods. The aim of my talk today is to offer an explanation for the rise of ultra-processed foods in human diets, adopting a food systems approach and focusing on the political, economic, and commercial determinants. Why might this matter? Well, by understanding the nature of the problem, we can inform dialogue, research, and new modalities of public health and food systems action. I will say that I am a social scientist, so this talk will be very different to the talks that came before. But it is based on empirical evidence that our research group has done with collaborators around the world. So my presentation today makes no argument against food processing itself. As Carlos has already pointed out, basic food processing has played an important role in human nutrition for many millennia. Our ancestor Homo erectus had, by around 1.5 to 2 million years ago, evolved relatively small teeth, reduced chewing muscles, and a smaller gut. And these were thought to be adaptations to the use of stone tools for slicing meat and grounding tubers and grains. And later came the use of fire for cooking. These early processing technologies reduced chewing time by about 2.5 million chews per year, or an entire month of chewing, resulting in a marked increase in available nutrients and very likely in the brain size of our ancestors. The conversion of foraged and cultivated foods into more palatable, safe, nutritious, and durable forms, for example, through heating, cutting, grinding, salting, fermenting, and smoking, enabled our hunter-gatherer and pastoral ancestors to thrive across many ecological zones and habitats. And later, in the agrarian era, beginning around 12,000 years ago, food processing enabled the growth of cities and entire civilizations, mainly through the mass processing and storage of grain, wheat, rice, and maize especially. Not all of this was good. At this time, we saw a reduction in human stature and height, and widespread stunting resulting from malnutrition. But of course, many of these processing techniques make nutrients more bioavailable. They contribute to our economies through providing employment and livelihoods. They make foods safer. They make us more food secure. And many of these techniques also contribute to food system sustainability. And of course, to food culture, from cheese in France to injera bread in Ethiopia to kimchi in Korea. These foods are celebrated, as are the meals and cuisines that are prepared with them. As Carlos has shown us, ultra-processed foods are much different to these other forms of processed foods. To understand the rise of ultra-processed foods in human diets, we should start with some history. It's hard to say what the world's very first ultra-processed food was, but in my interpretation, it followed the invention of carbonated water by James Priestley in the United Kingdom in the late 1700s, beginning the birth of the soft drinks industry in Europe, just at the same time when colonial industries were using slave labor to mass produce an abundance of sugar, arguably the industry's most important commodity ingredient to this very day. Sugar itself has a dark history in European society. King Louis XIV, the Sun King in France, banned smiling in his court because of the poor dental health that this abundance of sugar brought to the royals. Queen Elizabeth in the Tudor era in the United Kingdom had most of her teeth removed and lived a good part of her life behind a veil, disguising her teeth, which again resulted from a diet abundant in sugar. But it was Schweppes, the world's first soft drinks company, formed in 1783, that was to become the official beverage supplier of the British royal family, helping to establish the brand in high European society. And in this regard, the royal family were the industry's first social influencers. Companies like Nestle emerged in the late 1800s in Europe and globalized initially into the European colonies, alongside the invention of new processing and packaging technologies, and also the industrialization and factory production. 100 years later, in the late 1800s, we saw the birth of the global soft drink giants Coca-Cola and PepsiCo in the United States. The industry's second wave of globalization and of some of today's most recognized global brands coincided with World War II and military developments. Products like Spam, Nestle chocolate, and especially Coca-Cola, which established 64 new bottling plants between 1943 and 1949 with support from the US Department of Defense. And US service members in the field consuming more than 5 billion Cokes during World War II deployments. The military's development of field rations designed to be low cost, high energy, and tasty helped to pioneer food processing techniques. And later, the space era, national space agencies like NASA inventing whole new techniques like freeze drying, for example. The fast food industry, companies like McDonald's and KFC began in the mid-1900s before spreading globally to nearly all countries. The Golden Arches, together with Coca-Cola, becoming symbols of of globalization and US hegemony, or in other words, what is referred to as Coca-Colonization. And finally, as the industry globalized, so too did its marketing practices, with early forms of marketing focusing on print, radio, and later television, selling social status, using emphatic branding, and popular characters that were soon to become household names in many countries. However, it wasn't until the late 1890s onwards that the industry pursued global market expansion with a new intensity. In the context of slowing sales in their European and US home markets, the companies saw new market opportunities presented by the highly populated middle-income countries like China, South Africa, and India, with young and growing urban populations, rising incomes, and changing work practices. We can see this in the data here from 2016 to 2019, showing high but lesser per capita growth in the ultra-processed food markets of North America, Australasia, and Western Europe, but rapid growth elsewhere, although from a low baseline. When we look at total ultra-processed food sales, here represented in millions of tons, we can see that growth in middle-income countries more clearly, with total ultra-processed beverage sales expected to soon reach near equivalency with high-income countries. Here is a country-level representation of the same data, showing growth rates on the vertical axis and total sales on the horizontal. What I find fascinating about this data is that countries at similar levels of national income have vastly different growth rates and levels of consumption. So per capita sales in South Korea and Italy, for instance, are half that of the US and the United Kingdom. So this raises an important question. Why do some countries, but not other comparable countries, transition to higher ultra-processed food diets? To ask this question a different way, why do some countries resist the transition to higher ultra-processed food diets, retaining diets and indeed traditional cuisines higher in fresh and minimally processed foods? Data from national dietary surveys also show wide variations within countries, and Carlos has already spoken about the inequalities in ultra-processed food consumption and exposure in different countries. The lowest consuming quintile in Chile, for example, with just 3.8% of dietary share from ultra-processed foods versus the highest quintile of 60%. The highest quintiles in some countries are remarkable, with diets comprising up to 80% of ultra-processed foods in the United States. And these highest consuming quintiles tend to be children and adolescents, the very same groups that the companies target most aggressively with their marketing. And so this is essentially where we have arrived at today, in high-income countries at least. Ultra-processed foods are all around us. They make up most of the middle section of our supermarkets. We can find them in convenience stores, petrol stations, drive-thrus, at the cinema and in vending machines, at our sports games, on planes and trains, and through our smartphones delivered to us almost instantaneously through an app. We're confronted by what you can see here as a cornucopia of choice, and yet the most recognized brands are owned by a handful of corporations located in the United States, Europe, and Japan that make many of these ultra-processed foods from the very same commodity ingredients. So the question is, how do we explain the rise of ultra-processed foods in human diets, but also the variations we see across countries and contexts? I'd like to begin answering this question with the definition of ultra-processed foods from the NOVA classification put forward by Carlos and colleagues. The crucial difference between NOVA and other food classification systems is that NOVA not only offers a technical way of classifying foods by the degree of processing, but it also presents a social theory for explaining global dietary change. And here the focus on purpose of food processing is crucial because it indicates who produces the food, how that food is processed, and with what intention. According to NOVA, ultra-processed foods are made using ingredients and processes that are designed to make them highly profitable, convenient, and hyper-palatable products. And because of these commercial advantages, ultra-processed foods are ultimately liable to displace all other foods in human diets. Ultra-processed foods are the food systems that are aligned with this purpose, involving the commercial actors, inputs, and processes that take these products from primary production and manufacturing through to consumption and disposal, recognizing the importance of ultra-processed food supply chains and food environments and the underlying drivers that enable and indeed sustain the growth of ultra-processed food markets. And here, recognized by the large red arrow, emphasizes the power of the ultra-processed food industry to shape food systems in ways that grow and sustain ultra-processed food markets, using a number of market and political strategies, which I will now say more about. But first, let's try and understand this from a systems perspective. All systems, whether natural or man-made, have central drivers. The central driver of ultra-processed food systems is this, the growth imperative, an idea that lines very closely with the definition of ultra-processed foods offered by NOVA. The purpose is to generate, grow, and sustain profit. To me, this is illustrated by the words of Roberto Goizueta, the former chairman, president, and CEO of Coca-Cola, widely recognized as a business leader who grew Coca-Cola's market value from $4 billion to US $150 billion. In a speech to Coca-Cola employees and shareholders, he said this: "Right now in the United States, people consume more soft drinks than any other liquid, including ordinary tap water. If we take full advantage of our opportunities, someday, not too many years into our second century, we will see the same wave catching on in market after market until eventually the number one beverage on earth will be soft drinks, our soft drinks." This is precisely what Carlos was talking about in the NOVA classification. These foods, the corporate strategy that underpins them, is liable to displace with intention other foods in human diets. So the emphasis here, as you can clearly see, is on growth, and growth of a product that, I might add, is not only unnecessary for human nutrition, but harmful to both health and the environment. But that was just a statement. What about the evidence? And if Carlos's theory was true, that ultra-processed foods, because of their commercial advantages, are liable to displace all other foods in human diets, then we would expect to find evidence that the ultra-processed food manufacturing sector is, relative to other corporate sectors and industries, more effective at generating profits and capital returns for shareholders. This, in turn, would have a structuring effect on food systems because in a financialized capitalist system, resources are allocated to economic sectors and commercial strategies that generate the highest returns on investment. And this is what this study, led by Dr. Benjamin Wood of Deakin University finds that the global ultra-processed food manufacturing industry has become the most effective profit-generating and capital-distributing sector in the food system. Here in this analysis of corporations listed on the US stock exchange, we find that ultra-processed food manufacturers generate more returns for shareholders than the food-producing, processing, and retail sectors combined. More than 1/3 of all returns across all of these food sectors are generated by just 8 corporations: Nestle, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, Danone, Mondelez, FEMSA, which is a bottling partner of Coca-Cola in Mexico, and finally, Kraft Heinz. So what then makes these corporations so immensely profitable? How have they managed to grow and sustain their markets and generate these remarkable capital returns for their shareholders over the long term? The first is by minimizing cost. With globalization, corporations can source ingredients and other production inputs on global markets from wherever their costs are lowest. Here we can see the huge growth in the production of 2 essential main ingredients in most ultra-processed foods: sugar and vegetable oils, and especially palm oil. A nearly 6-fold increase in both since the early 1960s. The land use footprints that result from the production of these commodity ingredients is vast. Just one company, PepsiCo, for example, claims to have an agricultural footprint of 7 million acres. But it's not only commodity ingredients, but also other production inputs, such as plastics for packaging, cosmetic additives, and new technologies and manufacturing techniques that can convert this small number of commodities into a huge range of derivative ingredients that are used in the manufacturing of ultra-processed food products, and that result in the vast choice of products we now see in our supermarkets. The industry's latest wave of globalization is arguably much different from previous eras in its scale and intensity of change. What the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has termed hyperglobalization. This is characterized by international trade in final products across borders, less by trade across borders and more by foreign direct investment and the establishment by the companies of global production networks. For example, here we can see the expansion of the production networks for milk formula, which is a type of ultra-processed food product, the circles representing country-level production and the lines global trade, and the huge growth in production in countries like China. This is reflected in large investments made by the companies in their production capacities. Nestle, for example, having established over 30 factories in the Greater China region alone. The growth of the industry's production networks has been enabled by the liberalization of trade and investment, especially following the establishment of the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, resulting in reductions and barriers to the movement of products, services, investments, and technologies across borders. Here we can see data from Vietnam showing rapid growth in that country's soft drink market relative to unprocessed foods or non-processed foods following that country's accession to the World Trade Organization and the removal of barriers to investment by the soft drink industry. This also coincided with the rapid growth in supermarkets. As soon as Vietnam entered the WTO, supermarkets started to take off. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, a major feature of the nutrition transition is supermarketization, which brings with it many benefits: safe, and in some cases, many cases, nutritious food. However, the spread of supermarkets and modern convenience stores, or what Thomas Reardon refers to as supermarketization, is now a major feature of ultra-processed food systems. Here we can see it, shown in the greater distribution of these foods through modern retail channels relative to traditional channels as country incomes rise. So basically, the richer the country, the more supermarkets, the more ultra-processed foods. And supermarkets are very important to the manufacturers as well. Not only are they distribution channels for ultra-processed foods, but supermarkets collect reams of data. They transform the food system into a data-driven system. And this data is sent back to manufacturers, telling them what products sell best and which do not, informing the company's marketing and product development decisions. But in the absence of modern retail channels in emerging markets, where supermarkets cannot be found, ultra-processed food and beverage manufacturers have also developed novel strategies to target poorer and rural consumers. In China and India, for example, companies have offered smaller packaging sizes and affordable pricing points more appealing to low-income and rural consumers. Others have developed last-mile strategies to reach the so-called base of the consumer pyramid. In Brazil, for example, as seen here, Nestle used a floating supermarket to sell more than 300 products to small towns and villages throughout the Amazon basin. And through its door-to-door sales force, it reaches more than 250,000 households with more than 800 products every fortnight in many of the country's poor urban settlements. As the companies spread into more markets, they make large investments in the marketing of their products to promote and ultimately normalize consumption. Just one company, Nestle, for example, spends around $7 to $9 billion US dollars on advertising every year alone, a figure more than double the World Health Organization's entire operating budget. The company's marketing strategies are integrated, involving direct advertising and promotion to consumers, product and pricing strategies, engagement with health professionals and scientists, and public relations activities intended to promote a favorable image among consumers, civil society groups, and policymakers. These strategies are now empowered by new digital surveillance technologies that enable precision marketing, even tailored to individual consumers. And they make huge investments in corporate science, including the funding of academic researchers and their own in-house research infrastructure. The Nestle Nutrition Institute, for example, is claimed to be the world's largest private nutrition research institution, with 5,000 staff across 30 facilities worldwide, spending more than 1.5 billion Swiss francs annually to develop new products and marketing concepts. The companies also deploy a sophisticated set of messages, campaigns, and activities we can call public relations, corporate social responsibility, creating shared value, or in other words, what we refer to in the academic literature as reputation management. And this is starkly evident, for example, in Coca-Cola's recent sponsorship of the COP27 conference and of Nestle's of the recent Africa Food Prize. The companies give the appearance of being good corporate citizens by claiming to market their products responsibly through corporate philanthropy in the form of product donations during the COVID-19 crisis, and by greening their supply chains through so-called responsible sourcing. They also promote corporate science, claiming to make their products healthier and greener. The terms we can use for these kinds of activities is health washing and greenwashing. Coca-Cola using 25% less plastic in its packaging is arguably meaningless when its sales increase year on year for those very same products. Nestle sourcing so-called sustainable palm oil makes no sense whatsoever when the products themselves are unnecessary for human nutrition and harmful to health. But nonetheless, this is a powerful strategy by which the companies can maintain a favorable image and maintain their social license to operate. And while the companies, public relations, promote an image of benevolence and responsibility, the industry finances and coordinates a global network of lobby groups to counter regulation and promote policy environments conducive to sustained growth. Here we can see the network of the baby food industry, for example, which has been a major impediment, if not the main impediment, to the implementation of the World Health Organization's Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. This, I would argue, is much more than a lobbying network. It is a major structural feature of global food systems governance itself. These lobby groups have diverse functions and diverse areas of expertise, from impeding not only the adoption of government regulation, but also the promotion of voluntary self-regulation and multi-stakeholder initiatives and partnerships, or in other words, stakeholder and not shareholder capitalism, as an optimal governance model for food systems and sustainable development. Despite their existence for over 20 years now, Public-private partnerships involving the food industry, with only a few exceptions, have generated no evidence whatsoever of having reduced this problem. Ultra-processed food consumption continues to grow and displace other types of foods nearly everywhere. Such partnerships ultimately result in the least worst approach to regulating food systems, focusing especially on things like reformulation or front-of-pack labelling systems like Australia's Health Star rating system, which can be integrated into their marketing. The power of this network also lies in its coordination to counter regulation, not only in individual countries, but across countries and regions, and in international fora like the UN Food Regulatory Body, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and through interventions, very frequent interventions, in the World Trade Organization. And finally, another major feature of ultra-processed food systems are corporate front groups, through which the industry undermines the growing evidence that ultra-processed foods are harmful to health. And we have a new analysis on these front groups underway, and are mapping the networks of scientific influence that the industry has been funding. But these groups serve a key purpose for the corporations: to manufacture doubt and frame debate about the evidence, just as the tobacco, alcohol, and fossil fuel industries have also done. Here we have three such front groups: the two on the left, the British Nutrition Foundation, and in the middle, the European Food Information Council, have the appearance of being independent from industry, while the third on the right, Food Drink Europe, is an industry trade association. The British Nutrition Foundation, for example, claims to work with experts across the nutrition and food community to provide impartial, evidence-based information, education, and expertise, motivating people to adopt healthy, sustainable diets for life. All three of these organizations have developed position statements and shared research studies and media making several similar claims, including that there is no clear definition of ultra-processed foods, that the science is weak or flawed, that the real problem is nutrients and not additives, and that the term ultra-processed foods is confusing for consumers, among several other claims. Yet, when one looks a little deeper, the first organization has 47 food industry members, the second has 16, and the third has many more. And these are the corporate members that are common to all three of these groups. In summary, there is an organized attempt underway to undermine the science on ultra-processed foods. In conclusion, ultra-processed foods are a major feature of the nutrition transition, but with wide variation in the types, rates of change, and levels of consumption. Ultimately, this is consistent with what we would call a divergence theory of global dietary change. We are seeing a convergence nearly everywhere to a more ultra-processed global diet, but with divergences between countries and contexts. This raises really important research questions, I think, of why do some countries transition to ultra-processed food diets, whereas others resist or even counter the rise of ultra-processed foods, including through the very deliberate protection of traditional food systems and cultures. Ultra-processed food systems perpetuate the rise of ultra-processed foods in human diets and the harms to human health, the environment, and sustainable development. The core driver of these systems is a corporate growth imperative organized by the logics of global capital accumulation to minimize costs, to maximize sales, and generate sustained returns for shareholders, ultimately displacing or co-opting food systems, provisioning Nova Groups 1 to 3. Responding to this challenge requires a whole of food systems approach, not only actions to address the industry's marketing practices, including the reach of its supply chains and marketing, but also its political practices, which undermine the integrity of policy and of scientific institutions. And I think one of the key messages, especially from the evidence that we've generated on, and others here in the room, like Melissa, have generated through their research, is that we need to start ending the participation of the ultra-processed food industry in public policy and regulation. UNICEF, the United Nations Agency for the Protection of Children, has just in the last few days come out taking a very strong stance against involving food industry in public policy. against partnerships with the food industry, and it is our hope that other UN agencies will soon follow, and governments will soon follow that lead as well. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today. Mercy.